As you learned, during the Enlightenment, philosophers used a reason-based approach to study the world around them. Now you'll learn more about how philosophers applied this approach to studying government, beginning with the idea of the social contract. This will help us answer the lesson question: how did the Enlightenment influence ideas of government? As we mentioned in the warm-up, the Enlightenment was born out of the Renaissance. Philosophers of the Renaissance, like Niccolo Machiavelli, were influential to later thinkers. Machiavelli was a leading thinker in politics, science, and ethics. He was an Italian philosopher, historian, and diplomat. Machiavelli examined human nature outside of religious study. This was one of his biggest contributions to Renaissance thought, helping to begin an era where people looked critically at the way things worked without using the lens of religious belief. He developed his political ideas in The Prince in 1513. In The Prince, he portrayed a cruel leader. Today, historians argue over whether he wrote a satire to criticize monarchy or whether he believed that rulers needed to be cruel. Either way, his work inspired others. Based on his political experience, Machiavelli had a realistic view of the rulers and politics of his day. Enlightenment thinkers would follow his lead. Enlightenment thinkers began to criticize European governments ruled by monarchs, kings and queens in Europe, who were all powerful during this time. They argued against rule by divine right, held by many kings and queens who believed that God had chosen them to rule. Take a look at this painting. Here, King Louis XIV and his family are portrayed as Roman gods. Enlightenment thinkers believed that secular ideas, rather than religious ones, should drive government, and they took a secular approach rather than a faith-based one to studying government. Enlightenment thinkers challenged existing ideas by writing about the purpose of government. Enlightenment thinkers studied government by focusing on three topics. Authority. Where does a government get its authority? Rights. What kind of natural rights do humans have? Responsibility. How are citizens and government responsible to each other? Throughout this lesson, you'll see how different thinkers answered these key questions by using reason to create a logical understanding of how things work. Let's begin by looking at how Thomas Hobbes approached these ideas. Thomas Hobbes was an English philosopher and writer. He wrote The Leviathan about the purpose of government. He believed people are naturally selfish and violent. Hobbes wrote about the state of nature that existed before governments were formed, in which life was nasty, brutish, and short. Hobbes felt absolute rule was justified as a way of controlling essentially selfish human beings. Hobbes helped to develop an important idea about government. Let's focus on this idea next. In his book Leviathan, Hobbes proposed an idea called the social contract. A social contract is an agreement between people and their government. In a social contract, people give up some of their freedom in exchange for government protection. Hobbes did not trust people to rule themselves. He thought that most people were too selfish and thought only about themselves. This made life dangerous, so according to Hobbes, people needed a strong government to protect them from conflict. Hobbes thought the government needed authoritarian or absolute power. Unlike other Enlightenment thinkers, he thought only the most powerful government could protect people from themselves, so he thought people should be ruled by kings and queens. Let's take a close look at a quote that sums up many of Hobbes' key ideas. In this quote from Leviathan, Hobbes explains how law is created by a social contract. Law was brought into the world for nothing else but to limit the natural liberty of particular men in such manner as they may not hurt but assist one another and join together against a common enemy. He believed laws were good so that people wouldn't revert to their brutish selves, but might instead work together.
Thomas Hobbes also argued that every country should have the ultimate power over itself. This is the idea of national sovereignty. National sovereignty is the right for each country to have authority over its own laws and territory. A country maintains its independence only if its citizens and other nations agree upon it. For this to be possible, the citizens of that country and other independent countries agree not to do things that threaten that nation's independence. National sovereignty is the collective will of the people in democracies. National sovereignty is used to maintain territorial borders and the laws within those borders. Violating a country's national sovereignty leads to conflict.
You just learned about the goals of the Enlightenment: to take a thoughtful, reason-based, secular approach to studying the world around us. You saw how Hobbes applied that to his ideas of a social contract. Now we'll look at a philosopher who advanced the idea of the social contract and the idea of natural rights. This will bring us closer to answering our lesson question: how did the Enlightenment influence ideas of government? John Locke was an English philosopher known for his writings on the mind and natural rights. He studied politics and the government and wrote his famous work, The Second Treatise of Government, in 1690. Unlike Hobbes, he believed humans are naturally reasonable, and he continued to develop the idea of a social contract between citizens and government. Locke argued that humans have fundamental or natural rights, rights with which all people are born. Now, in Locke's world, all people meant white males. Locke believed natural rights are life, to live well; liberty, to do what you choose within the law; and property, to own your goods. Locke believed that these rights do not come from government. That means that government cannot take them away. Locke applied his idea of natural rights to his view of the social contract. Like Hobbes, Locke also believed that government is a contract. He argued that the end, as in the point, the purpose of law, is not to abolish or restrain, but to preserve and enlarge freedom. For in all the states of created beings capable of laws, where there is no law, there is no freedom. Locke is developing Hobbes' idea. Law is necessary to ensure freedom. People enter into a contract with each other and with government to preserve freedom. He thought that the purpose of government is to protect people's rights. And if the government fails to protect those rights, the people have a right to overthrow their leaders. Today, people are still striving to get governments to protect everyone's, all people's, natural rights. Locke's ideas can be seen in the Declaration of Independence, the document that created the new nation of the United States of America. It formally stated to the world that the people of the United States would no longer be ruled by the King of England. It was also revolutionary. It included many ideas that had never been applied in government before. First, we can see the importance of what John Locke said about natural rights. The Declaration of Independence uses his language: all men are created equal and have certain unalienable rights, including life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. We know that even though the framers used the term all men, they didn't really mean everyone. Who were they excluding? This passage also shows the importance of Locke's thoughts on government. They thought that the government should represent the people, and that the government's main purpose is to protect people's human rights. That is reflected in this phrase: to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men. Remember, Locke said that if the government fails to protect people's rights, then people have the right to overthrow it. You can see this here in the line, whenever any form of government becomes destructive of these ends, it is the right of the people to alter or to abolish it. This is how the leaders of the revolution justified their rebellion against Britain. Now, let's look at another important document from early US history. The preamble of the Constitution explains the social contract described by Locke. You can see from the opening words, "we the people," that the government's power comes from the people, and one purpose of government is to protect the people. Many Enlightenment thinkers also believed that common good is more important than individual interests. In other words, the government should promote the general welfare. The framers say that another purpose of government is to secure the blessings of liberty for themselves and their posterity. This means for their children, grandchildren, and future generations. So what does the US social contract look like in your neighborhood? Is the government protecting everyone's rights? Is the government passing laws for the common good? Are they securing the blessings of liberty for future generations? Locke believed in a representative government, much like the United States has today. He thought representatives should come from the land-owning classes. During the Enlightenment, this was a very small percentage of the population. Locke's proposal would give power to a small number of wealthy white men who owned property and would exclude everyone else. Locke thought these representatives should make laws to protect people's rights. He said that laws should apply to all people equally, and that the government's power should be limited. He thought kings and queens had too much power. However, Locke did not truly believe in equality. He put the rights of property owners above other people. He would not have included other groups of people. Locke built upon the social contract and argued that people have natural rights. Both of these ideas went on to influence the foundations of US government. Now let's take a look at the concept of separation of powers. To help us answer our lesson question, how did the Enlightenment influence ideas of government? Baron de Montesquieu was a French philosopher and social commentator who was famous for his writings on government and society and was inspired by England's change to a constitutional monarchy after the Glorious Revolution. He popularized ideas about how government and society should be organized and wrote The Spirit of the Laws in 1748. Let's take a look at his most famous work, The Spirit of the Laws. The Spirit of the Laws was where Montesquieu outlined his ideas on government and society. This work outlined two key ideas. Let's look at the first. The separation of powers was a means of limiting the power of any one person or group holds in government. He argued for separating the executive, judicial, and legislative powers of government. If the idea sounds familiar, it's because it's how the US government is organized. Montesquieu also argued in favor of checks and balances by creating a system in which each branch of government has some power over the other, another idea that proved influential in the development of the US government. Montesquieu described these key ideas in The Spirit of the Laws. He wrote, "When the legislative and executive powers are united in the same person or in the same body of magistrates, there can be no liberty, because apprehensions may arise lest the same monarch or senate should enact tyrannical laws to execute them in a tyrannical manner. The big idea is this: if one person has multiple powers, there can be no liberty. Notice that liberty is a word that keeps showing up as these writers discuss government. Now, take a look at this quote for yourself. We are answering the question, how did the Enlightenment influence ideas of government? Some of the big ideas about government to come out of the Enlightenment were the social contract, natural rights, and a separation of powers. But most Enlightenment thinkers had limitations regarding who these rights applied to. Enlightenment ideas about equality and natural rights did not include all people. Those in power did not believe that all groups were entitled to these rights. For example, women had few rights as they were controlled first by their fathers and then by their husbands. Women typically had no say in who they married or how they were governed. They couldn't vote. Those in power in Europe and the United States viewed indigenous peoples of the Americas and peoples in Africa and Asia as both foreign and less important. They established a racial hierarchy and then used these beliefs to justify the enslavement of people, particularly along racial lines. Many Enlightenment thinkers spoke out against these beliefs. One of these people was Mary Wollstonecraft. Mary Wollstonecraft was an English writer during the Enlightenment. In 1792, she wrote A Vindication of the Rights of Woman. This book was one of the most influential works in the history of women's rights. Wollstonecraft advocated for women's educational and social equality. She believed that women could excel in many different occupations and also as mothers. This idea was considered radical during her time. Wollstonecraft's ideas inspired women's rights movements that began in the mid-1800s in Europe and then the United States. Let's look at a quote from Wollstonecraft's book, A Vindication of the Rights of Woman. She wrote,
"Women ought to have representatives instead of being arbitrarily governed without having any direct share allowed them in the deliberations of government."
Wollstonecraft is challenging the lack of representation of women in government and a lack of voting rights. Let's look at another passage from the book. Here, Wollstonecraft draws on Locke's concept of the social contract, which, recall, argued the purpose of government is to protect people's rights. If the government fails to protect those rights, then it can be challenged by the people. Wollstonecraft argues that a government that ignores women is a defective one. She wrote,
"Is not that government then very defective and very unmindful of the happiness of one half of its members that does not provide for honest, independent women by encouraging them to fill respectable stations?"
by limiting a woman's role in society, what types of career she might have, a government is not living up to its potential or its duties. Now you will read another excerpt from Wollstonecraft's book.